vomitevole è chi, come la Francia, continua a sfruttare l'Africa stampando moneta per 14 nazioni africane sulle quali applica il signoraggio, facendo lavorare bambini nelle miniere, estraendo materie prime come accade in Niger, dove la Francia estrae il 30% dell'uranio che gli serve a far camminare le centrali nucleari e il 90% dei nigerini vive senza elettricità. Non ci venire a fare lezioni, Macron, perché l'Africa scappa da voi e la soluzione non è spostare gli africani in Europa, è liberare l'Africa da certi europei. Non accettiamo lezioni. Chiaro?
Everyone thinks they know the story of France in West Africa, a tale of cooperation, development, and shared progress. But that's the version written in Paris, not the version lived in Niger. The truth is far more explosive. For decades, one of the poorest countries on earth powered one of the richest nations in Europe, while France enjoyed bright streets, stable electricity, and a booming energy sector. Niger sat in the dark, even as its uranium lit up French cities.
There is no way this is possible. But France forced 14 African nations to sign a pact for the continuation of colonization between 1958 to 1961. When Guinea and Mali refused, France didn't just leave. They destroyed everything. They took furniture, equipment, even poured concrete into sewage systems, deliberately devastating these economies for daring to claim independence. The world barely acknowledges this colonial revenge. Meanwhile, Ghana's president attempted to create the first Pan-African Union to rescue these economies. This isn't ancient history. It's a shocking example of how colonial powers punished those who demanded genuine freedom. The scars remain visible today.
And the textbooks called it partnership, millions called it aid, but history forgot to mention the extraction, the hidden contracts, the military pressure, and the profits that never returned to African soil. And the world was told France helped Africa survive, but the truth, the dangerous truth, is that Africa helped France survive. And now that West Africa knows it, nothing will ever be the same.
Between 1958 and 1961, France did something absolutely horrible. France made the Francophone African countries, and I don't even want to use that terminology, but I only use it for the purposes of conversation. The 14 countries which were formally, but still colonized by the French, they were forced to sign a document that they called the Pact for the continuation of colonization. You heard me.
French President Emmanuel Macron has put it in writing, acknowledging that France committed atrocities in Cameroon after the country became independent in 1960.
For decades, the story of France in West Africa was taught to the world as a narrative of cooperation, development, and friendship. Textbooks described alliances, partnerships, and shared prosperity. School systems repeated the idea that France helped nations like Niger modernize, build infrastructure, strengthen their economies, and secure their future. That was the official story, the polished story, the version that protected reputations and erased reality. But behind the speeches and ceremonies was something much darker, a system built not to uplift West Africa, but to extract from it. And nowhere was that truth more brutal than in Niger. The world was told Niger was one of the poorest countries on the planet, unable to progress without Western aid. Yet beneath its soil rested one of the most valuable resources in modern history. Uranium, enough uranium to fuel reactors around the world, enough uranium to power militaries, enough uranium to determine the energy stability of entire continents. The truth was simple: Niger was poor because it made others rich. While French media presented images of humanitarian support, French corporations transported thousands of tons of uranium out of Niger every year. While the world believed West Africa was dependent on French assistance, West African minerals quietly powered the French energy grid. French households enjoyed electricity, comfort, and economic security, while families in Niger lived beside the very mines that supplied that power without receiving it themselves. The mines were secured through agreements that were never designed to be equal. The pricing was set by France. The distribution was controlled by France. The measurement reports were written by France. And when Niger attempted to renegotiate, pressure followed immediately: political pressure, economic pressure, media pressure, and sometimes military pressure through alliances France had built across the region. West Africa knew it was being drained, but France counted on silence. It counted on division between countries. It counted on the belief that no one could stand up to a European power that had ruled for so long. And for many years it worked, but something changed, not in France but in Africa. People across West Africa began to study trade flows, energy markets, and mineral values. The illusion started to crumble. If Niger was really as resource poor as textbooks claimed, how could it produce so much uranium for France? Why did France build military bases only near strategic mines and transportation routes? Why did development funds never reach the regions responsible for France's wealth? Why was West Africa told to be grateful for loans made from profits that originated from its own land? The silence broke first in academic circles, then across media platforms, then on the streets. Demonstrations rose not just against political leaders, but against the entire system that allowed France to shape West African economies for its own survival. Niger was the epicenter because Niger held the key to French energy security. Without African uranium, France would face a national crisis, a collapse of energy supply, a surge in electricity costs, and a massive economic shock. West Africa had been taught that resisting France would be too dangerous. France reminded them constantly of its global allies, its military power, and its influence on international financial institutions. But for the first time, West Africa realized something France didn't anticipate. France needed Africa far more than Africa needed France. That was the moment the balance shifted. Niger began to ask questions publicly. It demanded transparency in uranium pricing. It asked why profits never matched extraction levels. It asked why environmental damage around mining regions was never addressed. It asked why France could build energy independence at home while leaving West African cities in darkness. France tried to ignore the questions. Then France tried to minimize them. Then France tried to discredit them. But one thing France could not do was stop them. The more Niger pushed, the more West Africa united. Countries that rarely coordinated economically began to form a single voice. The message was clear. The era of resource exploitation disguised as partnership had ended, and despite decades of control, France wasn't prepared for unity. Suddenly, the world saw African nations rejecting agreements that were considered untouchable. Western politicians were stunned. Analysts called it reckless. Media labeled it radical, but West Africa called it overdue. The most dramatic shift happened when Niger refused to renew uranium contracts that had existed for generations. France assumed the threat was symbolic, that Niger would eventually fold under pressure. Instead, Niger doubled down and West Africa supported it. Countries pledged economic cooperation, energy integration, and shared infrastructure. New trade negotiations began with Asia and other non-Western partners. France found itself shut out of conversations it once dominated. For the first time in modern history, France could not dictate the economic terms of West Africa. Then came the moment that exposed France's darkest secret more than any protest could. French officials began warning the world that France's electricity supply was in danger, not because of technical failure, not because of weather, but because access to African uranium was no longer guaranteed. The warnings admitted what textbooks never did. Niger wasn't dependent on France. France was dependent on Niger, and the world began asking the questions that history books never taught. How many decades did France rely on Niger's uranium? How much wealth flowed into French banks instead of African ones? How much of West Africa's instability was manufactured to protect resource access? The story had been rewritten, not by historians, but by reality. West Africa wasn't weak. It was exploited. Niger wasn't poor. It was robbed. And France wasn't a savior. It was a beneficiary of a system designed to hide the truth. History books lied not by accident, but by design, and now the truth was no longer trapped in archives, treaties, or diplomatic secrecy. It was spoken aloud in streets, in parliaments, in universities, in every place where the future of Africa was being shaped by Africans and not by Europe. France spent decades believing it could hold West Africa in its grip forever. But it never imagined what would happen when West Africa understood its own strength and acted on it. France was stunned not by the protests, not by the speeches, but by something far worse: silence. For the first time, Niger and West Africa no longer pleaded for negotiations. They didn't ask for reconsideration or request improvements to old uranium contracts. They simply walked away, and instead of rushing back under pressure, they stood firm. That silence shook France more than any threat ever could. Every French strategy that once secured control failed. Political pressure was ignored. Diplomatic appeals went unanswered. Economic threats were met with new trade partnerships. Even the idea of military influence, a strategy France had quietly relied on across the region for decades, no longer guaranteed compliance. West Africa had changed, the world had changed, and France had not prepared for a world in which it was no longer in charge. Behind closed doors, Europe panicked. France's energy grid, heavily dependent on nuclear power, could not operate without uranium, and uranium imports from Niger had been the foundation of that system for generations. Without it, electricity prices would rise, factories would stop, and inflation would surge. Yet acknowledging this dependency publicly meant admitting the truth the world was never supposed to know. The illusion of control cracked further when West Africa introduced a new policy that stunned financial markets. Resource contracts would no longer be signed in European currencies unless African nations were treated as equal partners with full pricing transparency. For decades, trade had been conducted in the euro and the dollar, giving Europe and the United States enormous financial leverage. Now, Africa demanded autonomy not only in resources but also in currency. France scrambled to respond. Analysts warned of an energy crisis. Politicians offered speeches about historic ties and mutual cooperation. But West Africa had heard those lines for too long. They meant nothing anymore. The shift spread quickly. Countries that once stayed quiet out of fear found confidence in unity. Mali renegotiated mining agreements, Burkina Faso re-examined gold contracts, Senegal revisited offshore energy deals, Côte d'Ivoire reviewed cocoa pricing structures. The system that once guaranteed France cheap access to West African wealth began collapsing, piece by piece. Meanwhile, Niger was transforming not into a follower of another country, but into a leader of its region. Instead of shipping raw uranium overseas, it began exploring partnerships to build domestic nuclear energy infrastructure, not to sell electricity to Europe but to electrify Africa. For decades, France warned West Africa that nuclear power was too dangerous, too complicated, and too expensive for the continent. Yet somehow it was safe enough to power French cities. Now the hypocrisy was undeniable. West Africa realized the narrative of incapability was not based on truth but on convenience. The region was never lacking intelligence or potential, it was lacking permission, and permission had finally become irrelevant. At the same time, the global energy market watched with fascination. Countries in Asia, South America, and the Middle East saw the shift and began offering long-term investments under new terms written by West Africa, not by Europe. Suddenly, Africa had leverage no one imagined possible. Those who once dictated prices were now waiting in line to buy. France saw its control slipping and tried one last tactic: public relations. International media outlets began releasing stories claiming West Africa was making dangerous choices, that rejecting French partnership would lead to instability, and that Western oversight was necessary for economic sustainability. But the narratives no longer worked. West Africans weren't consuming foreign media the way previous generations had. They were producing their own information, their own reports, their own documentaries that told the story France never wanted told. The world finally saw the contrast. France's prosperity came from uranium. Niger's poverty came from uranium. One resource, two realities, both carefully hidden behind diplomatic language. And when the truth became global, France lost more than access to minerals. It lost legitimacy. What happened next was irreversible. West Africa initiated talks for a regional energy program where power grids would be interconnected to prevent outside influence. Solar fields, hydroelectric projects, and nuclear initiatives would create an autonomous energy ecosystem capable of supporting African industry rather than fueling European growth, with the potential of a self-powered Africa emerging. Global investors shifted strategy almost overnight. Opportunities that once flowed toward Europe were now flowing toward West Africa. Technology companies, energy firms, and logistics corporations started negotiating directly with African governments, not through France, not through Europe, but directly. For the first time in generations, Western companies needed Africa more than Africa needed them. This was the moment France feared most, not the loss of a contract, not the closure of a military base, but the loss of psychological influence. The belief that Africa was incapable had been France's strongest weapon. Once that belief collapsed, every system built on it began to crumble. The consequences inside France were immediate. Energy bills rose, public frustration grew. The illusion of stability vanished. Politicians blamed foreign interference, but citizens began asking hard questions. If Niger is poor, how has it powered France for decades? If Africa is underdeveloped, why is Europe dependent on its minerals? If France is a partner, why does Niger get nothing while France gets everything? The lies could no longer protect the truth. West Africa didn't celebrate. There were no grand speeches, no triumphant parades, no declarations of victory. The goal was never humiliation, it was liberation. Niger and its neighbors simply wanted fairness, dignity, and ownership over their own resources, and for the first time, the world was forced to recognize it. France tried to hold on to relevance, but the system it built was not adaptable. It relied on control, secrecy, and dependency structures that could not survive transparency, unity, and sovereignty. West Africa didn't destroy France. France destroyed itself by refusing to evolve. The world looked at Africa differently now, not as a source of charity, but as a center of power. And with every new partnership, every new infrastructure project, and every new resource policy, West Africa reclaimed a history that had been stolen and rewritten for centuries. The story was no longer France's to tell, it was Africa's.